All right, Brent Rubin,
Here.
Deborah Carpenter,
I'm present.
Jasmine Anderson, not present. Jerry Hawkins,
Present.
Krista Nightingale,
Here.
Linda McMahon, not present. Lynette Aguilar. Oh, is she on?
She's online.
Okay,
Don't
I'll wait
see
for her to first.
Yep.
And we'll come back just in case it's having any video issues. Matt Houston, Peter Goldstein, Roy Lopez,
Present.
Nathaniel Barrett, Jennifer Scripps, Joe Cannon, Colin Yarborough,
Present.
and that concludes our roll call. We do have a quorum.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is our Dallas CLUP Place Type Workshop number 4. Mr. Raghu.
All right, thank you all for joining us again. So today we're going to continue part 4 of our workshop and a few updates before we jump into today's discussion. So last time we had our initial discussion over the residential place types, and staff, we're going to be tweaking how we want you all to engage us and the information you're going to be sending to you all before and after. So after this workshop, you all will be getting the kind of the detailed version of the industrial place type that we talked about last time. So the workshop for that, those place types have been completed, and staff and a consultant have been updating that language based on your feedback. So after this meeting, you should be getting that either later today or worst case tomorrow, just to be able to provide that kind of more granular feedback at your own time. Same thing with these residential place types. So we're going to talk through them at a high level, kind of go over the land uses like we did last time. And then before we meet again, you're going to be getting 4 more place types, more detailed place types, similar to the industrial place types, more detail in terms of what type of connections they have with our themes, more detail in terms of the language. So by the time we come back again, if you have any issues or questions, please send that to us through email, or we can have a quick conversation during our next meeting. So today's going to be focused on the rest of the residential place types. Next time we meet, we're going to hopefully go over the commercial and most likely the urban core place types. So that's probably going to take us 2 workshops. So the idea is by the end of June, we should be done with the major place types that we need feedback from your team. And then by the time we get to July, we'll have a draft plan for you all to also review. So the idea is to knock out residentials today. The next 2 meetings will be focused on commercial mixed use. And then next month after that will be focused on providing feedback on the internal internal draft of the plan. So just want to give you all a quick update on that. So with that, we're going to jump into the 3 residential place types today. So we touched on the rural residential last time. We're going to touch on the traditional residential, the blended mixed use, and then the urban/city residential that we're calling it. So different scales of residential place types. All right, so what I'm going to do today is going to quickly go over I'm going to go over each of them, and then we're going to go back to residential just to have a conversation about the types of uses, what it's trying to achieve, where in the city these are generally located, and have my colleague Patrick Blades in the back too to answer any questions and help with facilitating conversations in terms of what we're looking to get from you all. So the first one, the second one, residential place type, is a traditional residential neighborhood. This one is predominantly single family with a mix of duplexes, townhomes, smaller apartments. There's an access to neighborhood. It's sometimes limited along major streets. And neighborhood commercial and offices are generally located around major intersections, and those are supporting uses. So just touching quickly on the supporting uses, we have public open space, public institutions, schools, etc., offices, private open space, agriculture. We're adding this as a supporting as we were looking at the urban ag plan. That's a use that we're probably going to be within this ag land use category, similar to the conversations we had about either having a separate land use or just incorporating it into our existing land uses. We're going to be adding that into the existing suite of land uses within agriculture. Transportation, utilities, those are the supporting uses, and the primary uses here are single family, attached, and detached. Again, I'm going to go over the three pretty quickly and then jump back to the traditional residential. So just graphically, these are the images that show the type of feel of this neighborhood. Again, single family is the predominant land use. So we have a few images that just represents what those look like. And at the bottom, we have schools, open space, religious facilities, institutions, neighborhood office, and neighborhood retail. And when we go into the blended residential neighborhood, this one is still predominantly single family, more of a mix of duplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, smaller apartments. This is where the variety of housing starts to appear more than the traditional residential neighborhood. The interior streets are generally in a block form with good connectivity. Commercial, retail, and office land uses are likely to be along major streets. So the difference on this one versus the traditional residential neighborhood is that incorporation of more type of multifamily housing stock, other types of single family attached stock as well, and also adding more mixed uses as a supporting component to that.
Can I ask a question? This is Linda.
Oh, go ahead.
Where do accessory dwelling units, kind of reside with the residential neighborhood mix? And then secondarily, is it just duplexes, or, I mean, can you look at quadplexes? Is there a limit in terms of the number of attached?
Yes, no. So there is, I guess, your latter question. There is no kind of limitation in terms of other quadplexes and kind of the middle housing stock. So that's also going to be part of this suite. And going back to your kind of ADU conversation, that's also something that each of these place types will have at a particular scale. I think one component we're going to be looking at too is what's the zoning going to say about how those get applied here in terms of what these are going to say. From a recommendation standpoint, is that yes, these can be allowed within these place types.
Thank you.
To answer your question, Linda, just want to make sure.
Yes, yeah, I just want to make sure that whatever we're doing on the residential neighborhoods, we allow for a little bit more expansion on small multifamily, like
Right.
up to 6 units or whatever that number is. But I just think that's just so critical to that missing
Right.
middle.
No, appreciate it. That makes sense. Thank you. And then just going back to the imagery, this has, again, more of a mix in terms of the suite of residential units and types of units that we have here. Even though we have a few images here, going back to what Linda just mentioned, these are going to include, quadplexes and other types of missing middle housing types within this residential place type. And the last one we're going to talk about today is what we're calling city/urban residential neighborhood. That's the term. We can kind of talk and play with that and let you all know what we're discussing as well. So this one is focused on mixed use and multi-family housing. The other housing, single family, attached and detached, those are supporting in some neighborhoods. Those still exist in those neighborhoods, but the predominant land use is mixed use and multifamily. Office, open space, commercial, those are all supporting uses. Again, this is focused on the residential neighborhood. We're going to have another place that's focused on just a commercial and mixed use, and that's usually the urban core and some specific mixed use place types. So we'll focus on this one. Is just going to be residential, but again, supporting use is going to be in concert with that. And looking at the imagery here, different types of land uses and forms that we see here. So there's an urban multifamily development, there's a more suburban multifamily development, and also mixed use development as well, where you do have residential units. And also, I think this particular example, this is City Place, where there's I think there's a Kroger, I believe, attached to this building, and there's offices on the bottom. So having a mix of uses is also what we're going to be looking at within this place type. All right, so I'm going to go back to the traditional residential. And actually, before I do that, I almost didn't show this, but because last time, but this matrix, I'm going to come back to this again. My own peril. No, so what I wanted to talk about is just looking at all the land uses all together within this matrix that are comprised of the four residential place types. So again, the rural residential place type that we looked at, predominantly single family, attached and detached. The focus is going to be more about the parcel and the spacing between those units and the density that we have there. When we go to the traditional residential, the same land uses exist. Here, multifamily isn't a supporting land use, and is focused on kind of the predominant land use and neighborhoods that we see in the city. As we transition to the blended, this is where we start to see more of that variety, more of that mix of housing stock. We had that multifamily being incorporated into this. Going back to the conversation that we had briefly last time, the creative housing, that can be part of that multifamily land use too. I think as we describe it and write out what that's going to be, I think just incorporating it within that particular land use and maybe others make sense. And then fourthly, the city/urban residential neighborhood. This one is focused on mixed use and multifamily, a denser type of neighborhood. Incorporates all the previous land use that we touched on as supporting, but the idea is that it starts to look at the more dense and more mix of uses within this particular place type. So I want to just stay here and just in terms of the mix of uses that exist, just looking at each other in comparison. I wanted just to make sure that the land uses made sense from a mixture point of view. So I'm going to keep this on the screen just for about a minute, just to kind of have you all ponder and look at one thing that we had within staff is as we look at the blended and traditional residential neighborhood, the idea about not including mixed use or multifamily as a supporting use. So something that we heard from the community in terms of being able to differentiate what that particular place type is versus the blended. So the blended, again, offers more of that variety. So I want to just kind of pause there, see if there's any questions just related to what you all see before we delve specifically on the traditional neighborhood. We can get back to this too after we go through the three. If you want to get back to look at this matrix, that might even provide more context as we have that conversation.
I have a question here.
Yes.
I mean, I think we can all think of examples of traditional residential neighborhoods that are naturally occurring. Can you give me some example, or are there naturally occurring blended mixed residential neighborhoods?
Are there naturally occurring blended mixed use?
Yeah, this is my as far as the evolving draft of the map, what are the criteria going to be for labeling an existing what looks like a traditional residential neighborhood, a blended mixed residential neighborhood?
Yeah, so I think as we were looking at on the map, kind of two things that kind of began the conversation was one, kind of the street kind of layout and grid pattern, the traditional residential neighborhood. And when we first did our first pass of that, that's kind of how we identified the difference between the more suburban sprawling type of kind of development pattern versus the more kind of grid setup. That was kind of the first pass. The second pass was looking at the actual land uses that existed there. So traditional is actually just focused just on single family detached, and with not that many or even any of those other residential land uses that were in that vicinity. So when we did those first two passes, those are the two kind of major items that kind of helped us to differentiate those pieces. But as we kind of delve further into that and having conversations with the public, we want to start to see if that there's more layers that need to be incorporated or removed to define that. I'm not sure, Patrick, if you have anything else to add, but that's kind of how we started that analysis.
Because the concerns I'm getting is feedback from some of the meetings out in the community is they are beginning to feel that the traditional residential neighborhood label is being applied to, I'll say the more affluent neighborhoods that mock a suburban style, that have, cul-de-sacs and, things like this. Whereas some of the older single family neighborhoods are, imperfect. I mean, they're linear block grids, and people are beginning to feel that their neighborhoods that are almost exclusively single, that seem to fit the traditional residential neighborhood, are going to be overlaid with the blended mixed residential, which could result in a pretty substantial change in character.
Right.
Yeah, so Patrick Blades with Planning and Urban Design. Good morning, everyone. Commissioner Carpenter, I would echo the same sentiment that I've heard in meetings, that folks who, because again, the blended residential neighborhood, you walk out the door, you look left, you look right, you see single family homes. That's the main type in that neighborhood. But in that neighborhood, and the reason why the word blended is in the beginning is because you start to blend it in other things in that neighborhood. Generally speaking, those neighborhoods are older, and generally speaking, those neighborhoods had, as you mentioned, naturally occurring duplexes or a small apartment building or corner store retail that just were developed with that community when it started, and as it has maturated. And so there are a little bit more things that have been in that community, but the intent in that neighborhood is still to have it to be a single family neighborhood that just has a little bit other types of land uses that have naturally occurred in there, and that may want to continue to occur in those communities as well. The concern about having that label be part of a community doesn't mean that community is then going to be rezoned to allow apartments throughout everything and all of that type of stuff. But it's the understanding that there are different types of communities, mainly residential, single family residential communities in Dallas. One that have more of the curvier streets, a little more limited access. The other ones that are more of that block grid street pattern, right? And how those urban forms are a different type of urban forms, and the land uses that are accompanying that, while though very similar, have a little bit of deviation from each other, the two different place types.
I hear what you're saying. The problem that's coming in West Dallas is that when zoning has allowed different types of denser residential development, that displacement and complete change of character just seems to happen like a snowballing domino effect.
Yeah, and in the descriptions that Lawrence referenced in the very beginning of the meeting that we're working on, and I hope they'll send out here soon, some of the design guidelines and some of the guidance there are going to speak to the fact that just because single family attached or duplex is an allowed land use doesn't mean that the entirety of, it shouldn't be, a whole street should be completely rezoned, and it should give that guidance to say, no, this is a naturally occurring thing, and it can occur if it's context sensitive. So hopefully to give some of that context to these primary land uses aren't allowed throughout the entirety of this place type, and that this place type is mainly a single family place type. It just has a different form than the other traditional residential place type.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Yes. Can y'all hear me, see me?
Ruben?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So I just want to push on that a little more, because I hear a few different things. I hear one of the hallmarks of a traditional residential neighborhood is not having the street grid, more winding, the cul-de-sacs. I think we have a sense of where that tends to predominate in the city. I also hear that one of the criteria for, a blended residential neighborhood is that, we already see some sort of blend potentially there, whether it's, more density near, major arterial streets. When it comes, is there a hard and fast set of criteria for making something traditional or residential neighborhood versus, making something blended in the current iteration of the map? I'm just trying to put my finger on what.
Yeah, I guess
What-
the major, yeah, so I guess the major differentiator is just that the mix of the land uses and the type of housing that exists there. So looking at the existing kind of lay of the land, there are some of those neighborhoods who have just kind of one predominant land use, which is like a single family detached. So I think that's the major kind of difference that we kind of looked at the beginning of our analysis, was kind of just the land use mix. As we continue to figure out what the future of these neighborhoods could or should, or what they want to be, a few things that we've heard too is that, adding that ability for a mix of other types of land uses. So that's going to look different for both the traditional and the blended. So the traditional might allow something like you mentioned. I think it was Krista also a few weeks ago, looking at the ADUs, and Lynn also mentioned too the other types of housing. So how we maybe define that when we develop the language might focus on specific types of densities and other uses that exist that might not be as exhaustive as the blended. So it might just have a limited suite of other types of land uses or building types that are allowed or desired. And then when we go to the blended, that just has more of that mix and variety that we're looking at. So I think that the major differentiator right now is the kind of that predominant single family neighborhood, which a lot of communities still desire to have. I think still providing some language that you could still have an ADU that can help to incorporate more housing, since that's a major component of what we're looking at to do in the city. That's kind of what we're looking at, but I'm not sure in terms of what you're kind of looking to maybe get. Maybe there's another question behind what you're trying to get. Is that are you thinking that this should be more robust in terms of the type of housing it's looking to incorporate, or maybe the locations of the city that we're trying to identify this into? Like, where do we need to be more specific with kind of those locations? Kind of curious of like the question behind the question that you're looking to answer or ask.
I'm not sure if I could personally know that the question behind the question. I'm just trying to figure out what.
Okay.
I can jump
but
in a little bit here.
Well,
And
I was
think
just gonna,
Patrick had.
Okay.
yeah, I was just gonna add one more thing as we're talking about these two different types of residential place types is, again, the geometry of the housing that's out there, or sorry, the geometry of the lots that are out there, and the age, size, and stock of those housing that are out there are different. So like in the traditional residential one, those lots tend to be wider but shorter. So those tend to be more 70 or 80 feet wide, but more 70 to 80 to 100 feet deep, whereas the blended residential place type, those are more narrow but deeper. So that might be 50 by 100, 50 by 150. And the housing stock that's in there, again, in the traditional residential neighborhood, because those homes, generally speaking, were built at the latter half of the 20th century, those tend to be 1,800 to 2,200 square feet. And again, there is deviation. And in the blended residential neighborhood, those tend to be either older homes that are smaller or newer homes, because those homes have been, the older homes were scraped and a newer home were placed on there. And so, from that urban form perspective, from that design perspective, they're a little different. And then, in talking with housing and talking with those different communities, the housing issues that they're experiencing are a little different. In the traditional residential neighborhood, those are more painted brick homes where people flip those. They buy the house, they paint the brick, they redo the kitchen, and then they sell it, versus the blended residential neighborhood where those tend to be homes where or properties in which people buy them, they remove the older structure and build a much larger, newer structure on those. So that's just one more way that we are looking at those two different place types that we have worked with the consultant on, and also in communities where we are having those conversations, the feedback that we are getting in the conversations we're having there.
Yeah, I think another layer on top of that too. So although this is, we're kind of looking at land use and not specific to zoning, that's going to be the component that happens after this. One layer of information they're going to be adding to the place type map is kind of the identification of conservation and historic districts. So I think having that kind of shown on a place type map, that helps the residents to see that their communities are going to stay predominantly mostly the same. Nothing's really going to change that character, because the zoning that's there basically has that kind of solidified. So what we want to do too, in terms of just the place type map that we're developing and these descriptions, is going to be another layer of information through the map that just shows where those historic and conservation districts are. So the community that live in those areas are sure that nothing's really changing in their neighborhoods. I think Commissioner Carpenter, you had a question or follow-up question.
It was more a comment. I'll confess, I'm getting more muddled the more I listen to this. But the fear that I hear expressed is the feeling that the poor, older, less affluent neighborhoods in the city that are almost, exclusively single family and built character are going to be coded blended residential. And I mean, you can look at the map, the first draft of the map for West Dallas. I think perhaps one neighborhood was coded traditional residential, and all the other residential neighborhoods are coded blended residential. You go south of 30, all the Kessler-Stevens neighborhoods are coded traditional residential. It's just a very stark contrast. And I'm just having trouble with this, because it seems to me if you code something blended residential, and I mean that shows an intent to direct development in that way. These neighborhoods are going to be asked to absorb a great deal more density than, say, a traditional residential neighborhood where the maximum density they might be expected to accommodate is ADUs. So I'm hearing a concern about equity issues, and I'm hearing it very frequently.
No, I appreciate that. And I think kind of two things that you touched on is kind of the location of those place types that exist on the map. So I'm going to briefly just jump into our map for a second. Again, this map is the older map that we had, but let me just zoom out here. So as we look at this map, the predominant color is that bright yellow, the traditional residential neighborhood that exists both in the north and the south. But going back to what you said in terms of as we update this map further, the fear of traditional being moved to residential, blended residential in the southern parts of the city. I think we want to make sure that as we identify kind of the suite of uses that exist in both the traditional and the blended, that you mentioned that we're looking at it from an equitable lens from that component. So we're going to be doing too, as part of our analysis, is actually going into each of the council districts and looking at the ratio behind traditional, blended, and other traditional, the other residential place types, just to see that composite mix, and then also looking at the demographic makeup that exists there. So we haven't completed that analysis. That's part of what we want to do too, because I think a lot of that conversation that we hear, we want to be able to kind of just have data to support that. I'm not saying that's you're wrong, right or wrong, or those who tell us that are right or wrong. Just want to be able to have some data to back that up. So just make sure that we are being equitable in terms of how it's being applied. But then secondly, too, the descriptions of those place types that exist, it's not going to be one place type that excludes particular types of land uses, and the others have to incorporate it. I think looking at the entire city, there's going to be more people coming here. So all parts of the city are going to have to look into housing those additional residents some manner. So what we want to do is make sure that we don't destroy the way that the neighborhoods want to develop and the way that these communities want to have their communities be, I guess, either maintained or developed too as well. So I think that those two kind of pieces in terms of adding housing and maintaining the character of the communities, that's kind of this balance that we're playing with. But we want to use the data piece on the next month or so, just to be able to kind of justify where that is also happening.
Yeah, and on the equity issue, you know, that's something that we've thought a lot about. I don't think the labeling of the place types is the best way to handle the equity issue. I think it's the policies within that place type.
Right.
Because you are right, Commissioner Carpenter. Much of West Dallas has that form of what we're talking about right now, of a blended residential place type. That's the same case in Old East Dallas. It's the same case in Parkdale, Urbandale, and South Dallas, and a lot of North Oak Cliff and areas of Oaklawn, because those are older areas that have those grid streets that have more blended stuff that's going in there. The traditional residential neighborhoods, yes, that's more Redbird, that's more Buckner Terrace, Pleasant Grove, that's more Casa View, Lake Highlands, North Dallas, far North Dallas, and so that's what those places are. But we need to then take a look at what our policies are in those place types to deal with some equity with equity issues there.
I'll just add that, West Dallas is probably experiencing as much redevelopment as any part of the city, and the single family neighborhoods that are largely north of Singleton, really want to maintain their single family character. And they feel that, we are rezoning so much industrial property south of Singleton and we're leapfrogging beyond blended residential and probably going straight to city urban residential, that, there is a natural pattern occurring that I don't believe the map reflects. And anyway.
Yeah, and we can have that, continue that conversation. And the other thing I would mention is many of those areas I just mentioned that were blended residential place types. There's a lot of conservation districts in some of them, and there aren't conservation districts in others. And I think that's something that our policy can begin to speak to say where are those blended residential place types that don't have those conservation districts that may need them and need a proactive change after Fort Dallas is adopted.
Is there any other kind of open questions? Go ahead, Commissioner Rubin.
Sure. I just want to dig into the traditional residential neighborhood a little more. Bullet point 1 says predominantly single family with a mix of duplexes, townhomes, and smaller apartments. But when we get to the bubbles in the bottom half of the slide, we have single family attached, single family detached, which I think, probably captures duplexes and townhomes.
Right.
But those smaller apartments, wait, don't fix anything. Is there room for, the occasional triplex or quadplex on the edges of what might be labeled as traditional residential, along some of the arterials that they butt against, that it might be a supporting land use. I mean, we're not talking about a 5-story wrap or anything like that necessarily, but small garden style apartments, a triplex, something like that. Is that something that's feasible under this?
Yes, so I think it might even be something we have kind of clarity from our zoning team in terms of the single family attached, that including, townhomes, quadplexes, duplexes, kind of that suite. You're speaking more toward kind of more denser than that, being kind of an adjacent or supporting, just to kind of clarify, or
like the occasional quadplex that may have a very similar footprint to some of the single family detached.
Right.
Is that something that's feasible
I think that's
outskirts of a traditional residential neighborhood?
Right, and I think that's part of actually the land uses mix that we do have here, is that yes, the form would look basically almost indistinguishable from the single family detached. In that character of how it looks and the feel would still maintain its character, but again, it would allow for that that nuance that you just mentioned, quadplexes. So that's kind of what we were thinking about too, in terms of that single family detached in this particular place type.
Then I'm really kind of having a little bit of a hard time with the messaging here. You know, single family attached, I think to a lot of people means townhomes and nothing more.
Mhm.
So I just want to make sure that we are, you know, fairly communicating that there is room for something other than townhomes and traditional detached single family in parts of these traditional residential neighborhoods. You know, I mean, the difficult question is what and where, but as we have it right now, I'm just, you know, in common parlance and in my parlance as a layperson, I see single family attached and single family detached as pretty limited, and there may be some room for a little creativity in housing types, even
Would it
within
make
what's labeled traditional residential.
Commissioner, would it make sense to have multifamily as a supporting land use, but then in the guidelines of what type of multifamily that is, have some design guidelines where we're saying this is not a 12-story tall apartment building multifamily land use, but it is a more context sensitive land use or multifamily land use.
I think so, and I think the devil is in the details there and trying to figure out what makes sense. But so I would definitely support that.
I do have a follow-up question about context sensitivity, because, when we're talking about the naturally occurring, somewhat blended neighborhoods, and we talk about single-family homes, detached, and duplexes, back in the day, you could drive by, you can drive down these neighborhoods and you can't really distinguish between the duplex and the single-family, but a blind person could distinguish between a current constructed duplex and a traditional single family home. And they just don't go together. I mean, you could call it blended, but they're immiscible. I mean, they just don't blend. So what are you envisioning that's going to make this increased density, new density fit into the neighborhood? I'm trying to think of this from a zoning perspective. And also that doesn't fundamentally alter the nature of the neighborhood in terms of lot sizes that would then be stabilized through future zoning, replatting requests, because there wouldn't be a pattern to the area.
Yeah. Yes. To your question, Commissioner, about walking down the street and you can't tell the difference between, is that a house or is that a duplex? Yes. Whether that's West Dallas or the M Street, yet like they're all of those housing types and those products that look very similar. And then you have the new duplex that is just garage with housing above it. Totally get that. And we've heard that time and time again in different communities. And that's where Forward Dallas can speak to design guidelines to talk about those naturally occurring, that ability to blend in different types of housing that's context sensitive, where again, you're walking down the street, it still feels like the same thing and not this jarring thing that's right next to a single family home. And then moving out of Forward Dallas, once we say here are design guidelines, that's where we tackle the zoning to say, okay, how do we achieve that? Through changes in our development code or with existing zoning districts or new zoning districts or regulations for platting that can achieve that context sensitivity.
I have one kind of question to the body. I think as we're kind of touching on zoning briefly before we kind of transition to our blended residential, and also think the conversation with both are kind of happening at the same time. So
Lawrence,
when it comes,
hey, this
sorry.
is Jerry. Before you
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
before you ask the question, I just want a clarity question from Commissioner Carpenter. Commissioner Carpenter,
Okay.
when you use the phrase naturally occurring, how do you define that?
I guess that probably wasn't the best wording in the world. I mean, it's because they're saying now that there are neighborhoods that already that have incorporated a variety of housing type. That was the way they were built. And it seemed to me that if you walk down through those neighborhoods, it looks as if there was a plan for things to look, to be in the same context for it all to fit. So, whereas with some of the new construction that is infilling in these older neighborhoods that might actually have duplexes and single family homes that all look about the same, the new construction is of a completely different type. Am I explaining that?
You're definitely explaining that, but I think we probably need a different phrase because that's not naturally occurring because there was a planned community, right? So I'm
Okay,
thinking
well,
of
I'd be happy to use something else, the original design, or I don't know.
and I'm just asking that because um, I'm interested in I think one of our members mentioned the equity question, particularly around place type.
That was me,
Obviously,
yeah.
this is not a zoning conversation,
Right.
um, but I am interested in how these place types reflect um, the zoning question that's in that housing equity audit that the city um, consultants put out, um, and how we can address this without I guess the universal language that's in that equity audit. You know what I mean? Because the unfortunate part about the place types are that everyone in our city doesn't have access to these place types, right? So there will be a particular group of folks who have a particular place type that they'll gravitate towards, and that may be income, it may be race, it may be um, now the ability to be next to the Trinity Forest or the Trinity River. So I'm just interested in how we see equity around these place types, particularly because they're very universal place types.
No, I think that's a great question. I think it goes back to the heart of the purpose and the kind of idea of these place types is that they are supposed to be this universal palette that the city, those in different parts of the city, can kind of understand. I think there's some places that you mentioned that some communities might not even have access or adjacency to some of these other place types just because of where they are or who they are actually based on just historically kind of looking at what happened in their community. So I think the idea behind kind of where they're located, that's actually a really good question as we kind of start to kind of clarify what these definitions are and then go back to look at where they're located in the city. I think that's a very important question. I think just for staff and all of this, I'm not saying I have an answer right now, but I think that's a great question that we're all thinking about as we go back and review the map and review the comments from the public and the CLUP is trying to figure out, like, although we're getting feedback that this place type should be here, here, and here from an equity standpoint, does it make sense? And then I think it's going to be something that we come back to you all with when we have the plan kind of starting to get formulated, is kind of going back to those questions like you mentioned. Does it make sense where we're putting it and why? So I think that's, for me, just a good reminder in terms of what we're asking ourselves as we start to kind of not just define these, but place them on the map.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence, for that. I mean, particularly because most of the development will be around neighborhoods that are shifting place types, I would assume, because that's the gentrification, right? There's new ability to create density in those neighborhoods. And most of the older, or I would say more even, not even older, established communities, those place types will be less likely to shift. So I think we have to think about what that means for community members who live in neighborhoods who place type may be shifting a little bit more. You know what I'm saying?
Right. So I think that's actually a piece of what we're looking at, going back to actually Commissioner Rubin's kind of thought behind the housing land uses that we are incorporating in these place types. So as we are starting to look at what these place types are, we know we need to provide a broader suite of ways of getting housed throughout the entire city. So I think what we don't want to do is kind of, as we kind of color this particular map, there are ramifications behind that. We want to be able to make sure that those who are in that community, if their community is shifting toward another type of place, that they can still, within the land uses that exist there, still get housed there, still afford to live there, and not deter them from, kind of continuing with their way of life. So I think that particular piece with the type of land uses that exist in these place types, that's a huge piece of what we're looking at, just to make sure that there is that variety of ways of being housed without, changing or kind of throwing community members who live in a particular area out to another place just to be able to afford to be housed. But that's a good question that we're all thinking about as we're developing and thinking through these definitions, because these colors on the map are going to have major implications in the definitions and descriptions, and we want to make sure that we're providing that kind of range and flexibility of still being housed in different ways and maintaining the character that the community wants.
Yeah, my last comment on that, because you mentioned affordability, I like bringing the current events to this space. I think there was an article that says now Dallas has slipped to like 140th best city to live in the country. And again, that is primarily around affordability and ability to access affordable housing. So I can put that in the chat, but I think that's a conversation we have to think about when discussing these place types, particularly because those gentrifying neighborhoods are usually poor neighborhoods, and if they are gentrifying and not adding the to Chair Rubin's point, right, the type of housing that everyone can afford and to live in, it will be very difficult to make this an equitable process. So thank you all.
No, I appreciate the comments. All right. So just at time, just want to transition to the blended. Again, I think conversation is going to spill over to all of these place types, but still want to still touch on those as we kind of have these themes in the back of our mind too. So going back to a few things that we've heard related to the land uses that exist in some of these place types. One thing I want to also think the question I was trying to ask too, as we kind of look at that traditional and looking at the blended neighborhood, going into like looking from a kind of CBC standpoint, from the community standpoint, we're looking at just different places. And I think what we want to kind of tease out and make sure that we're kind of reflecting is that these places that we are starting to define and flesh out, that they do make sense in terms of the communities that you all are part of and see as well, and also the future of what some of these residential communities are wanting to be. So going, as we transition to the blended, this one, the difference on this one now is the multifamily is now a supporting primary land use within this. It's the nuance between the traditional and this particular place type. Again, if you have like a traditional and a residential blended mixed use neighborhood kind of next to each other, that transition from one neighborhood to the other should be kind of seamless in terms of the land uses that kind of flow from one to the other. I think that multifamily, that type of housing stock, is that major differentiator with the ability to have more types of land uses. Going back to the matrix, just kind of see those in comparison to each other. Where did I put that? Yeah. So just going back to this matrix, what's different here is that the blended and the mixed residential neighborhood allows for the mix of uses. And also we have lodging being another component as a supporting use that would also be in this place type. So again, the core is still single family, but that additional variety of uses from a multifamily component and from adding more mix of uses is what this place type is different from the others. So I'm going to jump into the blended again, just look at the imagery that we kind of quickly developed and continue our conversation in terms of kind of the makeup of this particular place. So again, single family attached, we have multifamily, like neighborhood multifamily, including going back to Commissioner Rubin's comment about, quadplexes and other types of missing middle housing stock. That's kind of the primary use here. schools, open spaces, neighborhood retail, neighborhood apartments, and neighborhood offices are also supporting in this particular place type. Again, a lot of a mix of a lot of more uses within the supporting category. So I guess just initial reactions are looking at the descriptions and the land use mix. Is there any kind of questions or thoughts on why or where we're putting things here? This one, I think, based on the conversation we had in the previous place type, I think we've touched on a lot of kind of those descriptors and those elements. But I want to just keep this here on the screen if there's any additional kind of feedback, just the direction of this place type. I'm not sure if you have anything.
This is Linda. I guess my question is about the mixed use. I mean, if it's mixed use, but it's got a housing component. To me, mixed use includes housing. So if it's a blended residential neighborhood, why wouldn't you allow that?
Right. So I think here, looking at, let's just say like a live work unit, that could be something that's part of that. I think the mixed use, when we talk about that, usually when we kind of get away from this particular place type, is usually focused on this commercial mixes of uses and offices and et cetera. So I think having this as a supporting is just saying that type of development, you could see that here, but that's not the predominant type of use. So yes, definitely mixed use can have additional like residential types of units and commercial, et cetera. So I think the idea is just that there's a mixture of those uses that exist and that can be allowed here. Okay. I'm going to scroll down again. Just the imagery. So again, as we are in this, this residential neighborhood, this place type, again, there's a mix of different types of uses, and just imagine, being able to be on a street with, the single family image on the far left, then you cross a major, I guess, corridor, and then you see something that's more like a multifamily neighborhood. But again, like still having that ability to have a mix of those uses within the same neighborhood. That's something that we've seen in some parts of the city. So just want to make sure that the imagery too as well kind of falls in line with.
Question or comment?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I hope y'all can hear me. Earlier when Mr. Rubin was talking about adding multifamily in traditional neighborhoods, if you'll go back to the images, the neighborhood multifamily. I live in East Dallas, and I feel like there's lots of good examples on both sides of the lake of this neighborhood multifamily. I mean, whether you're even Munger Place has some, Casa View has some, or Casa Linda and Casa View have some. Is that where you were going? I just kind of, because I'm not sure why that's excluded right now in traditional. And I guess what I heard was an advocacy that I share to put that in traditional.
Right.
Fair. I just want to kind of underscore that.
Yeah, so the areas that you're referencing, some of those imagery referenced up here.
Yeah.
And so in that blended residential neighborhood, there is, again, more.
There's more in the blended. I totally get that. But what I'm saying is, did we put that in traditional as well now?
So yes, I would believe that as long as that neighborhood is still a single family neighborhood that might have a little bit of like an apartment, closer to a major intersection or something like that.
Yeah,
that could be part of the traditional.
In Casa Linda, Casa View that are duplexes and have this kind of, I think it works is my point.
Yeah. And then again, those land uses, there are areas of Casa Linda, well, more Casa View, that have duplexes that are there, it's a street of duplexes. Or it's a smaller apartment building, and those would be allowed land uses moving forward in that traditional residential neighborhood. That blended one, that would be where you're getting a little bit more of those land uses.
Right, it's a frequency issue. I totally get that. I just wanted to make sure that they both have it. I don't remember this picture in the traditional, so maybe it's a visual thing.
Okay, and the picture, are we talking about the one there on the bottom right?
With the red door, yeah.
That one?
Because I don't think that was in traditional, and I I feel like excluding it is going to be problematic.
Okay.
Which one again? Just make sure it was
Fair.
the.
Neighborhood
That's what I'm
multifamily.
I'm sorry. Got you. Let me do two things. I thought we actually had. Yeah, I think that actually was in this open space here, but I don't know.
Yeah. We can definitely make sure that some imagery and the language speaks to the fact that that multifamily in a limited scale would be something that's allowed in.
Well, I feel like it was said, and then I
Yeah.
saw the picture, and it was exactly what I was thinking. So
Right.
thank you.
Could I also make a suggestion here? Would it be possible, I mean, I know we're not seeing the entire document at this point, but would it be possible to include in these images some pictures of more modest homes that meet those particular place types?
Yes, yes, Commissioner.
And from neighborhoods that are south of 30.
So the picture with the red door is from a neighborhood south of
It
30.
is? Okay, good. I
Yeah.
just wanted to underscore that I feel like a lot of them feel very familiar, and I live north of 30, so just having to say that.
There was a concerted effort to try to get some of those imageries from both sides of 30,
Okay,
both sides
good.
of the river.
And I'm relatively new to the process, so
Yeah.
forgive me if I'm
Yeah.
assuming that.
But I will also say if there's any imagery that you see, even if you're just on Twitter and you're like, oh, that's a great, right? Send it to
Best
Lawrence or
example.
myself, and so that way we can, research and say, yeah, that's a good example, and we can go ahead and incorporate that.
Okay, groovy, thanks.
All right. Any kind of additional thoughts to what we've been talking about? I think really good kind of feedback in terms of starting to kind of just clarify what these are showing in these in the imagery and the text and the land use mix. I think that's the exact feedback that we're looking at, just to clarify as we develop these further.
Hey, Lawrence.
Yes.
I have like a half joking question,
Okay. Okay.
but I'm just like, at what point do we even need to break these residential types apart? Because I feel like what we've done is we've talked on both of these place types to the same ends.
Right.
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
Mhm.
But it sounds like the only real difference is the underlying grid that supports that.
Right. And I
At
think
least
that,
from a place type and
Right.
Geometry perspective. So it's a bit of a tongue in cheek question,
Right.
And I probably need to sleep on that a little more. And then
Yeah,
once y'all send these out,
Yeah, it's
Right.
definitely a question that staff and our consultant, it's something that we've taken a long time to think about, and I don't know if there's a perfect answer to it. There definitely is a difference, in the geometry of those blocks, right, and in the connectivity, and in the ability to navigate those different types of places either by automobile or not by automobile. And that obviously factored into how we're putting those together, and again, the frequency of some of those different types of land uses is also something that factored into it. And lastly, and Commissioner, I appreciate you pointing out that it's not naturally occurring. These were all very deliberate things that were choices that were made, so it's not naturally occurring within each other, but it's that frequency and then that blended part where in Casa View it's a street of duplexes. In North Oak Cliff it's two duplexes on the same block of a single family street, and so however that occurred, that occurrence is something that's also driving the difference between these two place types.
Yeah, you actually just kind of I think your question is actually something we talk about all the time. Like I think when we started this process, I think looking at the 2006 like for Dallas, there's kind of one residential place type. As we started to develop this, I think we started with like 2 and 3. Actually, we started at 2, and then our consultant was like, "That's typically what we typically see in the country." We added 2 more just based on the kind of community feedback. You know, people in certain communities wanted to be kind of in this particular type of place that's more traditional, like we talked about, and kind of the density piece was one piece that we're kind of afraid of. So adding that kind of suite just based on what we were hearing, you know, kind of it was ebbing and flowing. So it elaborates kind of these 4 place types because there are kind of 4 kind of unique types of residential neighborhoods that we see from a kind of high level perspective. So what the 4 Dallas 2006 didn't do was kind of differentiate that. So I think that traditional and the blended, there is a lot of overlap. But when you kind of look at maybe the extremes of those place types, that you can kind of see that those are actually different. So I think that's kind of what we're looking at too, is that there's going to be some places where they're kind of pretty much the same when you kind of look at certain kind of transitions or densities. But when you look at the polar opposites of a particular scale of each place type, then you kind of start to see the differences within those. But I mean, what we talk about all the time, we do have those same kind of conversations as well. But I think you kind of touch on it. It's not a hard kind of line. It's kind of there's some gray in terms of that transition and what's actually being part of that. And that's kind of where the sort of supporting land uses come into play to kind of help us with that. So I think when some of these cases come to CPC and other bodies, it's going to be up to those bodies to use this and kind of help them to kind of determine what's on the ground and what should be on the ground from particular land use decision, because they're going to know those communities better than a lot of consultants and what we're doing here from a macro level. So yeah, it's a good question, a good thought, and I think that's touches on a lot of things that we're talking about too as staff.
Yeah, thank you for expanding on that.
I have a sort of a related question thinking about that. I mean, are you getting pushback from these single family neighborhoods that are just reflexively opposed to density? Or is it they're opposed to density that is so out of scale? I mean, because back to trying to correct what I said earlier, the intentional blending that was done in some of these older neighborhoods, there seemed to be an effort to make the duplexes, the quadplexes, the single family homes appear to be a kind of a seamless experience.
Right.
And so I don't hear any objection to that sort of density
right.
in what's a more or less traditional single family neighborhood, but that's not what the infill more density is looking like these days. And that is very jarring and unnerving. So I guess I'm just wondering, you're going around the city, are you getting just knee jerk? We don't want more density, or at most maybe an ADU, but we don't want to see anything else.
And we can both talk on kind of what we've heard. So from what the communities I've talked to, it's kind of 2 things. You think these 2 pieces are kind of opposite, but they're not. So what I hear is that I want my community to maintain and stay the same, but also want flexibility of housing. So I think from a particular perspective, if it's a family who wants to provide or give the house to somebody else or rent it, they want that flexibility to be able to do that, but still kind of maintain the charm or character of that neighborhood. So what I hear is that I want to keep my neighborhood in the same kind of character, but I still want that flexibility to do more or to provide more options in the future. So that's what I've been hearing. I'm not sure what you've been hearing. It's kind of going back to maybe the other portion of what her question is.
So yes, I think I've heard something very similar where, there is that desire to say, okay, yes, keep this neighborhood the way it is, but yes, we do need housing choices. So how can we put that housing somewhere, along the corridor or around that community? But I would also say is, generally speaking, many of the conversations that I've had in communities, and whether that's, have been in Kleberg and in South Dallas and Far North Dallas and Old East Dallas and North Oak Cliff and West Dallas and a number of different communities, usually starts out with, I hate density, don't add any more density. But once we have a conversation, then it turns from that, because it's the initial point where someone says, this is horrible, I can't believe we're doing this. And then as you have a conversation about the nuance, you're shaking hands at the end, like, oh, that's what you're talking about. Like you're not talking about destroying, oh, you're saying that I can put a garage apartment over there. That's fine. Oh, you're saying that those townhomes are really good. I like, we should put those townhomes over here as well. Exactly. oh, when that church goes away, yeah, yeah. Oh, so that's what you're talking about. And so as we have this further conversations, it goes from the, uh, you know, the against any type of density to no, as long as it's thoughtful, that's good.
And I think the definition of density is different depending on where we are in the city. So I think we actually don't even use that term as much. It's usually we kind of start with that conversation about just additional housing. How does that look like in your neighborhood? We kind of start to talk about the different place types that looks different in different contexts, and the community starts to understand. Oh, okay, that's how you add additional housing here. You still maintain the character. It doesn't look like it's a huge kind of mega kind of development that's been dropped in my neighborhood. But we are adding quote unquote density in a particular way, but we're looking at adding more housing and more options in terms of maybe other types of uses that I can walk to as well. So I think with the conversation that we have, ultimately it is about density. We're adding more, types of uses and ways of kind of getting to a particular place in this small, in your same community. But we're approaching it through different lenses. If it's through housing, if it's through mix of uses, et cetera, but also talking about the contextual manner that's being done to achieve that.
Yeah, I like to use the word housing, not density. People like housing, they don't like density.
So is it talking about design standards to preserve the character of the neighborhood that's winning the argument? Is it location of where these alternate housing types might be, or a combination of those two? Or is it, say, a percentage of what types of alternatives, or kind of a blend of those things?
It's a combination. And again, as my colleague Lawrence, mentioned, it's the, we have communities in Dallas, and as long as we're doing our best to try to preserve those communities while adding housing, sprinkling a little bit in those communities and then adding additional housing around those communities to integrate it into it, right? That's the type of conversation that people like having. It's the old, I was having a conversation in one area of their community where they say, this is underperforming office. It's never going to do anything. Office is not what it is. These are 2- and 3-story office buildings. Those should go away. And can we put in 2- to 3-story townhomes and apartments, not garden style, but that type? Oh yeah. Okay. And that's an area that would traditionally say, we don't mess with single family zoning, but that's a community that said, yes, that's a great location for more housing.
Right. And I think last thing too, I think the last most recent meeting, we had a conversation within a predominantly single family detached neighborhood. And a lot of the things that they were looking to add to their communities, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with like Plano Legacy West, those neighborhoods where you wouldn't really think that a single family kind of detached neighborhood would want something like that. I think the ability to have some kind of connectivity or some kind of corridor that reflects that type of mixed use and denser type of residential neighborhood, that's something that we are hearing too, that communities want to keep their character the same, but they want access to those types of neighborhoods. So being able to figure out which corridors would incorporate this into their communities. So maybe their neighborhood stays predominantly blended or traditional, but then they're kind of close to a more commercial, mixed use commercial center corridor that helps for them to achieve or be close to that those types of land uses as well. So I think it's kind of twofold. Sometimes that particular place type could have those elements within the land use mix, or could be adjacent to a denser or a corridor that provides that mix of uses that can still kind of be close to, but still go back to their community and still feel like nothing's really been changed from what they're expecting to see.
Mr. Gu, can I follow up on that last comment real quick? You hit upon something interesting, saying that folks were, in more traditional single family neighborhoods were expressing, interest in a development that is more, like Legacy West, which has, mixed use, some high-rise residential, relatively walkable, especially for Collin County.
Right.
Are folks identifying where they want that? What comes to mind is there's a lot of, major intersections in the city that have four corners of traditional sort of shopping centers, which are kind of
Right.
concrete islands, anchored by a big box store, a grocery store with some smaller retail personal services. That where they're
Right.
looking at where there's interest in adding it, or is there not really a specific idea of where it should go?
Yeah, so there's actually kind of two parts of that. So there are some communities who know exactly where they would like that to be. There could be some underperforming corridors, like you just mentioned, some strip malls that could be that. There might be right now more of neighborhood type of mixed use corridor, but they want that to be more of a medium, denser type of corridor. So that's something that they've identified during the conversations. There are other conversations where they have no idea where they would like that to be. They just know they do like that access, or they've experienced other communities in the city and other cities that they would like to kind of have access to that, but not sure where that would be. That's kind of where some of the conversations from our planners is trying to figure out where and how can that get incorporated into their communities, or how can we kind of think about the future access to that in other neighboring communities. So I think we hear both in terms of kind of where or how to incorporate that.
Yeah,
And one
and
quick
Commissioner,
follow-up. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, so for the Legacy West, so when I've gotten feedback that says I want something like that, it's more in older garden, like concentrations of garden style apartments. They say we think these may go away at some point, and what would you like to have there? And they say we don't want just more apartments there. We want something more like Legacy West that has more shopping, that has more entertainment, that has more retail, because sometimes in those areas that have those concentrations of garden style apartments, there isn't the access to some of those amenities as well. Yeah, so I'll just add that.
Interesting. I can think of one or two zoning cases that we've had of that flavor before, which present some challenging issues with the garden style apartments, providing housing on the more affordable, attainable end of the spectrum, but at the same time, interest in putting mixed use in there. So that's a very interesting concept to continue to explore, and I'm sure that will come up in our next meeting when we look at some of the other
Right.
more commercially oriented districts. So look forward to that further discussion.
No, great comments. Thank you. All right. Sorry, as I'm typing.
And the only other thing I would add while Lawrence is typing is sometimes when we get those site-specific comments, that's where staff is pinging some of those to say, we can address a little bit of this through Forward Dallas, but this may be a conversation in 2024 to have after Forward Dallas is adopted, to say we need to come back here to do some more granular planning to figure out if there's a different, we've got a 30,000 foot vision, but we need to get a little bit more granular for some of those areas.
Oops. All right. All right, cool. So it is 9:50. Excuse me. I think we had to 10:30 for this meeting is what I was budgeting. So I'm going to transition to our fourth place type, third for today. Our city/urban residential neighborhood. So this one has kind of gone through a few name changes, and we'll probably get some feedback from you all too in terms of what you're thinking at. So this particular place type, I'm actually going to zoom into our draft map just for context. So this particular place type, this is the darker orange that exists just north of Fair Park by Baylor and also by Bishop Arts. Some portions is also kind of exists just south of Highland Park. But the idea is it's just a more denser type of residential neighborhood. So a few things in terms of this particular place type. It also exists in some places that are outside of the city center, the urban core, both north and south of the Trinity. But one thing I wanted to touch on, as we start to kind of think about what the name of this place type is, again, it is more quote unquote urban in character. As we kind of mentioned this in a few meetings before, when we use the word urban or suburban, different communities interpret that differently. So adding that kind kind of another term, city residential, has also been something that people have interpreted differently as well. So right now, we're still playing with that name, but the core concept is just it's more urban, it's denser in form. Just read these definitions and these bullets real quickly. So it's predominantly apartments, townhomes scattered with duplexes. Single family is a supporting land use here as well. It's comprised more of commercial and office land uses. The neighborhood includes both large and small scaled streets. So as we look at this, the mix of land uses that exist, again, predominantly focused on multifamily and mixed use, and every other use minus industrial are supporting in this particular place type.
Why is agriculture a supporting use? I'm really struggling to think of a place where that's.
Yes, so that the reason we kind of added this, and something we're still thinking about with the urban ag plan, the way having agriculture being incorporated in all parts of the city. So it might not be like specifically like we're thinking about like a farm, but maybe a way of incorporating urban ag into those types of developments in areas where they don't traditionally have access to agriculture. That's kind of why this has been added as a supporting use. So we're still thinking about the definition, if that's going to be something that we just redefine this agricultural land use to lean more on a lot of the urban ag definitions that we've seen from that particular recent plan, or if it becomes its own component. So that's why it's there, and we can maybe talk through that with our body here. Look, a good question. That's why I was asking for the small some questions too. And I think one thing that we did here, I think when we didn't have this from last week, when we showed that urban ag kind of as a land use component, is just we had this feedback too as well, is that can that just be incorporated in just these land use that we have here, just to reduce the number, but be really specific in what we're trying to define in each of these place types. So we can look into that too as well. All right, let me just go to the imagery again, just for a refresher. So again, this looks at different scales of multifamily in different contexts. So like I mentioned before, a lot of this exists close to the city center, but also a lot of this, or some of this can also exist in parts that are not close to the city center, more suburban context that we have in the middle image, kind of sort of a more suburban multifamily, maybe walk-up apartment. And then also to a mixed use development where you do have a mix of apartments, a grocery store, offices, etc. within the particular development. So what I want to do here, I'm going to actually go back to our matrix just to compare all of these together, and then we'll go back to the definitions.
Mr. Agu?
Yes, Mr. Rubin.
Can I hop in with one quick comment on the city / urban? I may have mentioned it at the last.
Okay.
I've got a colleague on the plan commission who represents one of the districts in the southern sector, who says that urban is not necessarily well received within her district. The term urban itself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm understand that it's a term that's been used for a long time, and some people have various connotations with it. I'm not an expert in the term myself, but I just and there may be some very strong pros in favor of urban. I've just heard regularly from this member that there are some concerns about how urban flies with certain folks in the southern sector. So I don't know if urban makes sense. Maybe city residential neighborhood, strike urban.
Right.
I don't have all the answers here, but I did want to flag that.
No, I appreciate that. That's actually why, yeah, no, 100%. That's kind of what we heard too as well. Not just in the southern sector, but actually just those communities that are closer to either the suburbs or other neighboring cities where this place type it still exists. So I think that connotation of urban can mean multiple things. I think that idea of increasing the density or being kind of having a different particular form that's not in concert with what they're used to seeing either downtown or in their neighborhood. So just going back to this imagery here, that urban versus suburban, having that maybe that urban type of multifamily in those parts of the southern sector, or even the north parts of North Dallas. Those could seem to be out of scale or context, but we wanted to show is that there's a kind of a range of that type of development that could occur. So I think that going back to that name though, if urban, we've heard that that could have a different connotation. So that's why we had city. But either way we go with that, we hear kind of like 50-50 that some people like when they see the city, they understand like, well, then Dallas is an entire city. Like, why is that? That leads confusion too as well. So that's why we're adding both here, just kind of like think through what would be another alternative name that we could kind of identify. Urban usually has a pretty good understanding, but in some parts of the city, it's a connotation that we want to also think about.
I've got a quick question.
Oh, was that Mr. Hawkins? Oh,
Anderson.
Mr. Anderson, go ahead. Thank you.
I think that adding suburban in the title might help. I think because the perspective, I think from some of the commissioners on urban versus not urban, I don't think that there's a play towards going rural, but I think that there's just a sentiment to protect the large lots and the trees and the context, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's rural. So I think that it fits into your description of how urban is being described in different communities in different ways. But having suburban, for instance, the southern sector, if it had the audacity to call itself a suburb, I think would be going in the right direction. And that's something that I think that would help kind of solve the kind of confusion around some of the diction.
Yeah, we talked about actually there's different ways that this can go too. Like thing within this particular place type, say we added suburban and urban, suburban/urban residential neighborhood, like having those two in that particular kind of description is two things that come up. So one, whenever we do show that to a particular neighborhood that is suburban in character, and they see those lists of land uses, that they kind of balk at that. So I think like another thing is like we separate it into two, but then that goes into basically the avenue that we don't want to go is creating basically a place type for each land use, and that's not what we want to do. So I think another direction too is that that city residential, which doesn't even have urban or suburban in the title, kind of this I would say more objective type of title that you can kind of delve into those different directions of urban and suburban within a description, but it still encompasses those two. So that's still something we're playing with. I think your feedback also is one of the things we're looking at in terms of how do we think about just that title, because I think based on the feedback we had from like previous meetings ago where like we were introducing flex and some other land uses, I think that definition, the description of the title, can kind of just have people think about something totally different. So we want to make sure that if we do add or remove any of those suggestions, the kind of the implications to other communities too. So it might right now the current title makes sense for some other communities. Say we do add the suburban, I think those who are okay with it then will have an issue with what we have to. So we're kind of playing with what we're hearing back and forth, but good feedback.
Do you think there's an option at just calling it residential neighborhood types as opposed to city, suburban, urban? Because we're talking about the city of Dallas and all of the residential neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah, so I think that this is one of the 4 residential neighborhoods that we have. So I think having a descriptor to talk about what that could be is something that we've played with. So if you can just kind of touch on a few of those examples. Again, let me see, where am I? Okay. So another one, just kind of just bringing things up like metropolitan residential, compact residential village, just different names that we just thrown out there to talk with. And so internally, I think what we heard with the city is what we heard with our residents. I think they've been gravitating more to that city residential. But I think again, we're still not kind of landed on something that makes sense for the entire city. So we do have a few that we're still kind of throwing around.
All right, sounds good.
So, what we're talking about here is like a low to mid-rise multifamily neighborhood. That basically, I mean, are we talking about, it's like the village?
This is, I guess the
areas around Bachman Lake,
Yes.
the Vickery Meadow.
Yeah. Well, so the village, yes.
But
That would be in a city residential neighborhood. Some of the areas around Ross Avenue in Old East Dallas, some of the areas around Buckner or Ferguson that have more apartments, some of the apartments that are located up off of Frankfurt and far north Dallas, some of the stuff around Berkeley Park, like those are some of the areas where you have some, and again, the areas that you referenced around Bachman Lake, around Love Field, those areas where, again, walk out the door, look left, look right, that's no longer single family. These are apartments, these are townhomes. That's the main thing that's happening here.
Yeah. To me, like something like low to mid-rise multifamily neighborhood is about as descriptive as it gets, but you don't hit the city, the urban, the suburban, the whatever.
Yeah, that was actually that was another.
That's the best I can do. Sorry.
No, that was so. That's actually, we had a conversation about calling these like just that, like high, mid to high, mid and low, kind of like just the density. But I think
I think the density difference is the clearest because Uptown is not a low to mid-rise multifamily.
Right. So I think we're going to touch on this too. I think when we do provide that, I think we actually started with that with our initial conversations with the community. We actually mentioned some of those examples, and when we mentioned that, what do you mean by high? Like high density? Like, oh, no density. So I think like it's everything that we kind of put out there.
I think rise helps.
Right.
Low rise people kind of understand.
Right, but I
Mid-rise,
think
they go,
that was actually a path we had, was like that low kind of mid, kind of that track too. So that's something that we've talked
Using
about.
empirical measures,
Right.
given these terms here more loaded than you might see at first glance, is probably the cleanest, and it's a good proxy for the way things are cited, the geometry of the area,
Right.
when they were built. Like it's capturing a lot of that. If you just use something that's an empirical range
Right.
as your first filter.
Right.
Well, and to that point, from a language perspective, that keeps the language more focused on the actual place type, which is kind of what we're going for. And
Right.
it eliminates some of those other connotations that might come up.
Right.
Amenities, race, class, things like that.
Right.
At least as it somewhat stands today, I'm sure as a society we'll probably find other ways of loading language up, but at least trying to keep it based on some sort of form could probably be
Right.
beneficial.
No, that makes sense. I think there's some other communities that we've looked at, some peer communities where they didn't even use the low, mid, high. They just go like residential community number 1, like kept it really just basic and had the descriptions basically elaborating what they are. So we still want these place types to be able to kind of still understand what they are. So that might be a way of playing in the middle. We'll kind of talk internally with our consultant too as well. We have kind of talked through these two as well. So I think hearing that from you all and the rest of the community, just curious what the rest of the body thinks in terms of if these were to be kind of thought about, just the low, mid, high, what that could do and what that could help in terms of community feedback. But I'm not sure. I know you have a few more thoughts on that too.
Yeah, the only resistance we got in the community of calling them, 1, 2, or 3, or using a more empirical term is that people say, "What are you talking about?" Like because of when you remove those descriptors that are loaded descriptors, but when you move those descriptors, they say, "I don't know what you're talking about, Patrick.
Right.
What is medium neighborhood? What is to neighborhood?" And so that was, the feedback that we got a little bit on that line of thinking. And again, we're very conscious that there probably is no perfect answer to any of this. Yeah.
Lawrence, I have a question about how we're thinking about the connectivity of these place types, particularly in the neighborhoods.
Okay.
And if this the work we're doing informs that connectivity, Like someone mentioned Bachman Lake. I built a family center in Bachman Lake, but in order to create that family center, I had to create some walkability, right? I had to create a sidewalk from um, the main street to the family center. Um, how does this place type inform the connectivity to the other place types, if that makes sense?
No, that's a fantastic question. So two things. I'm actually gonna go to one of our older, kind of more descriptive place types, just for an example. So within, I'm just going to go to the flex industry since that's the one we talked about recently. So within these place type descriptions, part of what we're going to be doing in terms of what we describe is how they do connect and what they're focusing on with the connectivity piece. So the character description is going to talk about, it's going to be, for example, we want to have a focus on pedestrian connectivity, walkability, in terms of maybe developing a 15-minute neighborhood where you're able to kind of get all of your necessities and kind of core activities within a walkable location. But I think within specifically kind of the theme connections that we're going to be looking at, those kind of reminder of the themes that we have within Fort Dallas. So environmental justice, housing affordability, rural and agricultural greenfield areas, TOD and connectivity, which is a specific theme, and then economic development. So within that particular theme, that's going to be where we write and kind of describe how we want that particular place type to address connectivity and TOD within the city. So each place type is going to be located differently, but in the general, I guess, standpoint, there are going to be certain elements that we want these place types to address. And what you're going to be getting in the next week are those place types with these descriptions and how we're trying to focus on connectivity with each of those place types.
To that point, Lawrence, does that include walkability and also crossability? And I'm thinking about most of these place types are separated by what we described as streets, but they would more aptly be described as highways.
Right.
For instance, like Northwest Highway, like a 6-lane street, right?
Right. Yeah. So
and people have
no,
to drive to go to that park. They can't walk to that park, So I'm
yeah,
interested in,
right.
in what that means.
Yeah, so what we're doing, there's two things we're doing with that. So our complete street kind of manual or guide that we have. So we're going to be adding another overlay to these place types, which identifies and shows the types of streets that should exist around within these place types. And for those not familiar with our complete street manual, basically it's a manual that has different types of street typologies. So going back to what you just mentioned, Mr. Hawkins, some of these streets are basically just kind of scars in communities that separate one side to the other. The complete street manual kind of talks about how do you have a street that not just has traffic that can go through the corridor, but how do you have pedestrians using that particular street, crosswalks, how it's played within the context of a neighborhood. So we're going to be identifying those particular types of streets and corridors within these place types. This description is going to talk about the emphasis on pedestrian connectivity and what we want to see from that particular component. So it's going to be kind of heavily reliant on the text and the language to speak to those important items that each of these place types should be trying to emphasize as they're kind of applied throughout the city.
No, that's great. So last question, is it part of our guidance to provide infrastructure suggestions to connect these place types? For instance, like pedestrian bridges, walkways, things like that connect some of these things?
So not necessarily, but I think kind of to connect what you're saying though, I think when we do create the place type map, another layer of kind of information that it's going to have is going to show kind of priority areas that either a particular location might be changing from a land use perspective, or a particular area needs to be kind of maintained in a particular perspective. What that's going to help us do, or help other bodies do, is when a project does come in, and, like you mentioned, like a pedestrian bridge, et cetera, if that's within a particular focus area that we identify in the map, that might have a certain priority or or relevant or focused in terms of how it gets kind of gone through the development process. So although we're not looking at specific development or infrastructure projects in here, this will help to identify or focus where in the city those should be kind of prioritized, though.
Last question, because you mentioned priority. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
The how would that priority be determined, particularly because Dallas is infrastructure poor? You know, it's 90% sidewalk poor, for instance. How would,
Right.
in a 90% sidewalk poor city, will priority be determined? You know?
Right. There's actually two pieces, and I think Patrick's going to touch on the last piece. So, from a kind of neighborhood planning perspective, we have, like, let me step back. So we have current processes, authorized hearing, for example, that have certain scoring criteria to be able to kind of move certain projects or zoning cases, up a queue based on priority of equity, having a land use plan, et cetera. I think to build upon that, Patrick and his team are going to be developing a process in terms of where communities that are lacking with some of these kind of certain infrastructure components or don't even have a land use plan can start to develop one and help them to kind of focus where that priority or where that focus needs to happen from an infrastructure component, from a development component, and from just a land use development component. So I'm not sure if we want to elaborate on what that is going to be looking like, but the idea is that there'll be another layer of information to help staff, but also the body, to help appointed and elected officials to be able to understand and see where the focus should be in their districts, because ultimately they're going to be the ones to fund those projects. All we can do is provide information in terms of where that should be focused on based on land use, based on lack of infrastructure. Other plans like the racial equity plan have focused in certain parts of the city, housing, all those are going to be different layers that we just add to help the body make, the decision makers make the decision of where to focus infrastructure.
Thank you, Lawrence.
On a proper question. I think somebody went off mute for a second. Just want to make sure. Go back on here. Okay. I had a question. I forgot it. Hopefully, just looking at these notes will help me jog my memory. Oh, actually, it's more of a comment. So as we get the comments that we have from this particular exercise, we're going to be sending, again, like that, a packet of more descriptive language for each of these place types. And that will likely come to your desk either end of the week, beginning of next week. So what we're going to want you all to do is similar to, and just going back to the flex, since we talked about that last time. So it's going to look similar to this. What we're going to be asking is that as you get each of the place types, all the 4 residential place types, the questions that we want you all to help us answer is, one, the land use mix that exists there, does that make sense? But 2, going back to kind of the latter questions, especially that Mr. Hawkins mentioned, is how are we applying some of those themes into the place types? So going back to TOD, the connectivity, does the language make sense within that place type in terms of how we're thinking about applying and emphasizing those particular themes in these place types? So each place type looks different and has a different range of density, even connectivity. So I want you all to help us look through how we're addressing some of those theme connections and see if that even makes sense from your perspective as well. So as we do send that to you, we'll provide instructions in the email and how to provide the instructions. But this is what you all will be receiving. Before we meet next time, you should be receiving these 4 in the industrial place type, so 6 total, hopefully. We'll let you know if something happens that changes that timeline. So by the time we meet again in 2 weeks, I believe, I'll confirm, there'll be some homework that we hope you all can provide information back to us so we can develop those further.
Mr. Gu,
Yes, sir.
what format are we going to get those documents in?
Yes,
just so we can figure out how to.
Yeah, it's going to be PDF.
Perfect.
Right. So those can be sent to us directly by email. We can also print those out. Hopefully our printers work by end of this week, so we can get that for those who want to come in person and print those out. And if there's any other format that you would like for that to be sent to you all, just let us know and we can make those accommodations. All right. So in addition to the handouts, I want to just mention one other thing. So as we move toward the summertime, the plan is to have a draft plan to talk through with you all. We're thinking probably around July, and the idea is we want to make sure that the total package of the plan, the place type descriptions, the map, how we're connecting implementation items to the plan. We'll have a presentation about that as well. And what we're going to be planning on doing is, as we kind of develop these descriptions, we're starting to package that into a document that's going to be hopefully pretty light, so it doesn't kind of delve into too much confusion for anybody who reads it. The idea is kind of present that to you all, get some feedback initially before we present that to the public, and then use the summertime going into the fall for public comments on the plan, get feedback, provide you all with the kind of overview of the feedback from the public, and then basically handing off or getting your recommendations to hand off to CPC, and then they continue that process to council moving forward.
What are going to be the format for those public, input sessions? I'm just curious. I wasn't here in the beginning.
No worries. So we're actually developing that. So it's actually going to be multiple formats. So what we're planning on doing is there's going to be a series of basically a virtual open house that's going to exist and be open for like 60 days. We're going to have pop-ups within each district where we just go out into the community, either have a kind of virtual computers, iPads, etc., and just going through like a particular district for a week at a time, just kind of talking about that particular plan, and then also just opening up our offices for people to come in and kind of get some feedback. So we're going to continue the engagement in multiple formats, and we're going to be focused on particular areas in the city for basically a few months at a time. All right, any additional questions? All right, so with that, that is all that I have. As usual, thank you all for incredible comments. Oh, did you have something else?
Yes.
Oh, no.
I think
wanna-
they've turned the
wanna leave?
refrigeration
Nah.
on, just the air conditioning.
So I guess for those virtually in warm environments, thank you for attending.
Need gloves and hats here desperately.
Right.
Yeah. I think the remaining item on the agenda is to approve the minutes.
Right, so
of the
hand off
last-
back to Commissioner Carpenter.
Right, was that
Yeah.
May the 9th? Was that the meeting date?
Yes,
Okay.
it was. May 9th.
So I would entertain a motion to approve those minutes. Thank you.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin. All in favor of approving the minutes of May the 9th, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, minutes are approved and the meeting is adjourned at 10:19. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.